Hi guys, welcome back to the channel. Today's video is how did the average American live in every decade? This will be interesting. I'm hoping this is going to take us right back in time, back, I don't know how many years, but every decade. So we're in it for a bit. We're in it for a long haul. Yeah, I'm intrigued to see. I don't really know much about how America lived in every decade. Don't really know much about how English people lived in every decade. But obviously, like, we know the main ones, like the war and things like that. We kind of know a bit about that. But yeah, this could be interesting. Make sure you guys like and subscribe. If you want to see us back in America in April 2026, we do have a GoFundMe link, which is in the description. Nothing is expected, of course, but anything is greatly appreciated towards our trip. Yeah, let's get straight into it. How did the average American live in every decade?
Ever wonder how the average American lived in every decade? From the founding of the nation right up to modern times, are we really better off now than we were back then? Hi everyone, Ken here. Hit that subscribe button and let's explore this house. From the late 18th century through the early decades of the 19th, life in the United States was marked by a rough simplicity that seems unimaginable by modern standards. Imagine a young family in the 1780s living in a small wood-framed house with just 2 or 3 cramped rooms. Their home might stand on a patch of cleared land surrounded by dense forest or rolling fields. Odds are, there are 7 or 8 children or more, plus a grandparent or two, all sleeping in shared beds or on straw mattresses in a drafty loft.
Wow.
Privacy is a luxury they do not expect. Everyone gathers around the same fireplace for warmth, cooking, washing, and conversation. Most Americans in these earliest years were farmers. Some owned their land outright, while others were tenant farmers paying rent in either labor or produce. With no electricity,
I think it's crazy to think as well, like, when you think about people sharing beds and rooms and things, like, for a lot of us, that seems like mind-blowing that even happened. But it's still happening. Like, we have still got people that aren't even sleeping in houses. It's baffling how we've come so far, yet not in some ways, I guess.
No running water, and only the faint glow of candlelight or oil lamps, life after dusk quickly descended into near darkness. Colds, fevers, infections, and complications from childbirth routinely claimed lives, driving the average life expectancy down into the mid-30s or even the early 40s. Even so, people pushed forward day by day, fueled by the ideal of a new nation and the determination to carve out a living on whatever patch of earth they could call their own.
Yeah.
Most fell into what we would now label as the lower class, toiling primarily to ensure they had bread and porridge on the table, a roof that did not leak too much, and clothing sufficient to keep out the winter chill. By the early 1800s, new inventions like the cotton gin and advances in small-scale manufacturing helped shift some regions towards increased trade.
So confusing to use. Wow. I wouldn't have a clue where to even start.
And mechanized production. But the average person still led a hardscrabble life rooted in agrarian routines. While an elite minority in coastal cities built more refined, multi-room brick homes and dined on imported goods, most Americans continued living on simple homesteads, sharing limited space with extended relatives, and in many cases, farmhands or apprentices who bunked alongside family members. In towns, the typical home might rise 2 or 3 stories, yet multiple families often cram themselves onto different floors or split up the rooms, so a single building could house a workshop on the ground level and living quarters for 20 to 30 unrelated people above it. Diets leaned heavily on cornmeal, salted pork, locally grown produce, and seasonal fruits when they were available. A sudden drought, a harsh winter, or a cholera outbreak could topple an entire household's security in the blink of an eye. Doctors offered only primitive treatments, and diseases like smallpox or dysentery tore through communities all too often. Despite the general hardships, America's population soared, especially as immigrants arrived in port cities and either settled in growing urban neighborhoods or ventured west in pursuit of cheap land. This westward movement was built on the promise of personal land ownership, which remained a powerful dream for many poor families. Still, even those who managed to buy or claim land had to endure punishing conditions in areas lacking roads, markets, schools, or even medical help. Surviving on the frontier demanded endless labor from sunup to sunset and forced people to adapt to a daily grind that was physical, isolating, and susceptible to every whim of nature.
You've got to do all that all day, and then you go home and it's not like you've even got like a relaxing kind of calm environment at home. It's just, I don't know how they did it. I don't know how they did it.
1800s rolled on. The nation's character began to shift under the weight of industrialization. Factories sprang up in places like Lowell, Massachusetts, employing young women lured from rural villages by the promise of wages that could support their families or help them save for marriage. These mill girls, as they were called, resided in tightly packed boarding houses. Privacy was minimal, though some boarding houses advertised better conditions than cramped city tenements. Meanwhile, in large urban centers along the East Coast, the poorest residents, often newly arrived immigrants, squeezed their entire extended families into single-room flats, using communal
Wow.
outhouses and collecting water from shared pumps in cramped courtyards.
That's
Diseases ran
crazy.
rampant in these conditions, and child mortality remained painfully high. Yet
Yeah, I
industrial
imagine.
work, low-paying as it was, sometimes offered more consistent income than a struggling farm. A handful of people were able to move from rural poverty to a slightly more stable footing in towns or emerging factory centers. Although by modern standards, they were still part of a lower class existence where the line between comfortable and desperate was razor thin. And all of this considered, they were still considered average. Life expectancy in these years crept upward only a little, inching toward the
Okay.
mid-40s for those who survived childhood, but the environment could be harsh and unpredictable. Every decade,
That's
new
not long,
waves
is it? Mid-40s. That's not great.
of cholera, typhus, or yellow fever devastated entire communities, taking a toll that kept average lifespans depressingly low. Diets were rarely luxurious. A typical worker or farmer relied on bread, potatoes, salted meat, and maybe some fresh vegetables in the summer. On the frontier, people supplemented rations with wild game, learning to smoke or salt any extra meat for the harsh winter months. Living spaces on farms did grow bigger if families prospered. They might build an extra bedroom or expand the kitchen from a single hearth to a wood-burning stove, but most households
Okay.
continued to share every square foot with a large brood of children. Conditions did not improve substantially for the average person when the war broke out in the 1860s. The Civil War ravaged the South, destroying homes and displacing countless
Wow.
families. In the North, factories ramped up production for the war effort, and people crowded into urban centers, straining the meager sanitation systems. Even as railroad lines multiplied, linking more places than ever before, the gulf between the
Okay.
truly wealthy and the average worker widened. By the late 1800s, often called the Gilded Age, industrial magnates basked in opulent mansions while laborers toiled up to 12 or 14 hours a day in hot, noisy factories or in the fields as sharecroppers, perpetually in debt. A
Crazy.
typical working family was still living in something we consider near poverty conditions. The hope of climbing into a stable, comfortable life existed for a lucky few, maybe a foreman in a steel mill or a store owner in a prosperous small town. But for the majority, day-to-day survival and paying the rent for a cramped tenement apartment defined reality. As the 1900s dawned, progressive reforms and scientific breakthroughs gradually began to reshape daily life. Public
Okay.
health measures like sewage systems and cleaner water supplies started to reduce disease in big cities. Vaccines and improved medical practices saved more children than ever before. Although
That's
wide
good. So
swaths of
things are
rural
kind of on the up a little bit. Kind of everything's slowly getting a little bit better by the sounds of it.
America still lacked electricity or indoor plumbing, new household gadgets and better food preservation methods like canning introduced a flicker of convenience. Life expectancy rose from the high 40s to the low 50s. The average American was still not what we'd call affluent, but by the time World War ended, a modest upward trend became noticeable. Factory wages, while still meager, could often support a family, at least enough to pay for rent in a multi-room apartment rather than a single tiny space. Immigrants poured in, often forming tight-knit communities that shared expenses and living quarters, but these new arrivals also fueled the country's industrial might.
Yeah.
In the 1920s, the economic boom that followed the First World War allowed some families, particularly those in better paid factory or office roles, to afford small suburban homes or comfortable apartments. This is the first time in American history when the average person could afford their own single-family house. Though enjoyed for
Wow.
decades by the wealthy, electricity, indoor bathrooms, and telephones made life easier for the average person, and diets expanded to include more meat, dairy, and fresh produce delivered by improved transportation networks. Yet this forward process was short-lived for many. The Great Depression of the 1930s dragged families back down into poverty. Millions lost their jobs, and thousands lost their homes to foreclosure.
Wow.
Hoovervilles, the makeshift shantytowns on the outskirts of big cities, underscored how precarious life could still be. Those who retained steady
Crazy.
work were considered fortunate, even if they shared a modest apartment with relatives or took in boarders to pay rent. Food often consisted of bread, beans, cheap cuts of meat, or government-issued staples. Sickness or injury meant dire straits, as there was no widespread health insurance.
Yeah.
While the New Deal provided relief, built infrastructures like dams and roads, and implemented public health initiatives, the bulk of the population by the end of the 1930s would still not have been called middle class in today's sense of the term. The more realistic label remained working class or lower class, with a few small improvements in housing, sanitation, and wages. But World War II changed that equation. Wartime production ramped up factories and opened opportunities for women and minority workers, though segregation and discrimination meant these gains were not shared equally. The government's GI Bill transformed post-war America by helping returning veterans pay for college and secure low-interest mortgages, fueling an unprecedented housing boom. Suddenly, in the late 1940s and 1950s, entire neighborhoods of single-family homes with lawns, driveways, and brand-new appliances sprouted in areas like Levittown, symbolizing a shift in how the average person lived. Life expectancy soared into the mid-60s, aided by the shift in how the average
$7,900. Wow. What is that in today's money? Let me know in the comments below.
Person lived. Life expectancy soared into the mid-60s, aided by the widespread use of antibiotics like penicillin and new vaccines. Prosperous industries paid wages that allowed a single breadwinner to support a wife and children, again, largely among white families. This was the moment when the average person, for the very first time, could truly claim to be part of a middle class. In earlier centuries, only a small segment of the population achieved anything beyond subsistence. Now, a far larger proportion access stable housing, reliable diets, complete with modern refrigerators stocked with meat, dairy, and produce, and a sense of long-term security. Televisions, cars, and home appliances like washing machines spread rapidly, changing life and leisure and closing the gap between the quality of life of the average person and the wealthiest in society. Throughout the 1960s and 1970s, more people moved into suburban areas. Homes got bigger, eventually adding extra bathrooms, dedicated dining rooms, and usually enough bedrooms for each child to have their own. Though cities faced new challenges, pollution, crime, and decaying infrastructure, continued medical advances such as the polio vaccine dramatically reduced or eradicated diseases that have once been crippling. A typical suburban family no longer had to worry about a child dying from smallpox, and maternal deaths in childhood plummeted due to improved care. By the 1970s, although inflation and oil crises pinched the economy, the expectation that one could own a car, buy a single-family home, and send children to college had become the new normal for the average American. Life expectancy pushed into the 70s, reflecting better overall health, improved healthcare, and lower rates of dangerous infectious diseases, though chronic illnesses like heart disease, cancer, and obesity-related conditions took their place as leading causes of death. In the 1980s and 1990s, the average home size kept growing, reflecting Americans' desires for larger kitchens, multiple bathrooms, and separate bedrooms for each child. Personal computers began sneaking into middle-class households, at first as simple home terminals, and eventually as full-fledged, internet-capable machines by the mid to late 1990s. Meanwhile, more Americans found work in the service or tech sectors as manufacturing jobs started to wane in some regions, mostly being shipped overseas. Healthcare became more sophisticated, though it also grew more expensive, and insurance was often tied to one's job. Nevertheless, life for the average person remained a world apart from the daily struggles of earlier centuries. Supermarkets sold fresh produce year-round, freezers allowed bulk storage of meat, and microwaves provided effortless meal preparation. Poverty was still a...
Microwaves are the biggest influence in my cooking ability is the use of a microwave.
Reality for many, but the baseline for poverty was often better, materially speaking at least, than the daily existence of an 1800s homesteader. The concept of being middle class had become so common that most Americans identified with it, even when income levels varied dramatically. When the new millennium dawned, the housing bubble that formed in the early 2000s allowed a broad segment of the population to purchase homes they might not have afforded otherwise. That bubble burst in the 2008 financial crisis, leading to foreclosures and rising unemployment. Yet the long-term trend still pointed to greater amenities and comforts compared to any point in history. By the 2010s, smartphones, fast internet, and online shopping had woven themselves into everyday life. The average adult could look up health information online, order groceries for delivery, or even work remotely, a concept unimaginable for a 1770s family struggling to light a candle in the evening. Meanwhile, life expectancy climbed into the mid to late 70s for men and around 80 for women. Diets became more varied, offering everything from fast food to organic produce to specialized vegan or gluten-free items. The onset of the pandemic in the early 2020s created new challenges. Many people felt the economic squeeze, some lost jobs, and those who could work remotely often retreated to bigger living spaces away from city centers. Within a few years, the price of housing and basic necessities skyrocketed, squeezing the
Yeah.
middle class into a smaller but still significant portion of the population. Still, when held against the backdrop of centuries, the average individual today benefits from robust medical knowledge, better education, advanced technology, and living conditions that farmers of the early republic or factory workers of the 1850s would have considered luxurious. Although inequalities remain, and not everyone today feels securely middle class, the
Sure.
average person in the United States enjoys a level of material comfort, safety, and longevity that would have been deemed unimaginable in 1776 or even 1876. Even if you happen to share your living space with a couple of roommates, that is a far better improvement than sharing it with 20 to 30 roommates.
Yeah.
On balance, the average American is indeed far better off now than in the past. There is more food security, greater access to medical help, safer housing, and a wealth of technological wonders that have made life not just easier, but also more connected and full of possibilities. Given all these transformations, one can confidently say that while hardships persist and socioeconomic gaps still exist, the story of
Yeah.
the average American is largely one of progress. From a life of
Mhm.
perpetual toil and precarious subsistence to one in which the majority can aspire, if not always achieve, the comfort and security we recognize as the middle class dream. And with that, I'll turn it over to
Yeah.
you. What are
It's definitely it's definitely important to note that obviously not everybody's life is the same in America. Obviously there are people that still share bedrooms, you know, still don't have the luxuries that a lot of people do, but I think in terms of life as a whole, things have moved forward and got better for so many people. So I think that's also important to note as well. But yeah, I think just be grateful for what you have, and we could have been sharing a small room with 30 other people. So you know, life has improved. Hopefully, you guys are doing okay, and it has improved for you as well. But if it hasn't, hang in there, and I guess we'll see what the next decade brings. Have a fantastic day.